Ford just put a number on the table that could completely reset the electric truck market. $29,945, not $70,000, not $60,000, not even $40,000. Ford says its new electric pickup, the Fathom, will start just under $30,000, including destination. And somehow, that is not even the most surprising number in this story, because only 2 years earlier, Ford was reportedly losing around $44,000 on every electric truck it sold. Its electric vehicle business burned billions. The F-150 Lightning failed to come anywhere close to its original hype. Ford canceled its next-generation electric truck program, and the company eventually took a staggering $19.5 billion charge. By almost any normal corporate logic, that kind of disaster should have pushed Ford away from affordable electric pickups for years. Instead, Ford turned around and announced one for less than half the price of a Cybertruck. Jim Farley is calling this Ford's Model T moment, which sounds like the kind of phrase a CEO invents for a press release until you look at what Ford has actually changed underneath the truck. Because the Fathom is not simply another battery-powered pickup with a cheaper sticker. Ford appears to have torn apart the entire process that made the Lightning expensive, redesigned the vehicle around manufacturing cost from day one, borrowed ideas from Tesla, licensed battery technology from China, rebuilt a Kentucky factory, and created a truck that could force every electric pickup manufacturer in America to rethink what an entry-level price is supposed to look like. The $29,945 number is the headline. The real story is how desperate Ford became before it arrived there. Go back to 2021, and the F-150 Lightning looked like one of the safest bets in the entire electric vehicle industry. Ford took its most recognizable truck name, electrified it, and immediately collected around 200,000 reservations before ordinary customer trucks were even rolling off the assembly line. On paper, it looked almost impossible to fail. Americans already loved the F-Series. Ford already had dealerships, factories, loyal customers, and decades of truck credibility. All it had to do was translate that enormous audience into electric sales. Reality was much harsher. The Lightning peaked at only a little more than 33,000 sales in 2024. Ford can move roughly that many gasoline-powered F-Series trucks in about 2.5 weeks. Worse, the electric operation was consuming extraordinary amounts of money. Ford's EV division lost approximately $2.2 billion in 2022, another $4.7 billion in 2023, and roughly $5.1 billion in 2024. More than $13 billion disappeared across those 3 years alone. The truck that was supposed to prove traditional Detroit could compete with Tesla became an example of how brutally expensive that transition could be. By December 2025, Ford had seen enough. Lightning production ended. Project T3, the next-generation electric truck Ford had been developing, was canceled. The company announced a $19.5 billion charge tied to its EV restructuring. Farley openly acknowledged the central problem. Buyers were not lining up for $50,000, $70,000, and $80,000 electric vehicles in the numbers automakers had expected. Consumers might like electric torque, quiet driving, and home charging, but there is a limit to what mainstream buyers will pay for those advantages. Ford did not abandon electric trucks. It abandoned the assumption that an electric truck could be built like an expensive conventional truck and still somehow become affordable later. Hidden inside the wreckage of that strategy was a different promise. Ford said it was developing an affordable electric platform with vehicles beginning around $30,000 and arriving in 2027. At the time, after billions in losses, that claim sounded almost absurd. Now the vehicle has a name, it has an announced price, it has a factory. And crucially, it was not created by taking an existing gasoline pickup and finding somewhere to install batteries. Ford formed a team in Long Beach, led by a 12-year Tesla veteran, and started with a blank sheet. The platform became what Ford calls its universal electric vehicle architecture, and that clean sheet approach explains why Farley's Model T comparison matters more than it first appears. The truck itself is called Fathom, a name Ford reportedly spent 9 months selecting. The company wanted something completely new instead of leaning on Bronco, Maverick, or another existing badge. The word has 2 meanings. To fathom a problem is to understand it deeply, while a fathom is also a traditional measurement of water depth equal to 6 feet. It is unusually philosophical branding for a pickup, but it fits Ford's message. This truck exists because the company had to get to the bottom of a very expensive problem. The base vehicle is priced at $28,350. Add Ford's $1,395 destination and delivery charge, and the total becomes $29,945, barely slipping underneath the psychologically important $30,000 barrier. That puts the Fathom in roughly the same price territory as a well-equipped Maverick, Ford's popular compact gasoline and hybrid pickup. Think about what Ford is attempting there. Instead of asking mainstream truck shoppers to spend $20,000 or $30,000 extra simply because the vehicle is electric, Ford is trying to make the powertrain choice almost secondary. Gas, hybrid, or electric could potentially exist in a similar financial neighborhood. That is the exact opposite of what happened with the Lightning, and getting there required Ford to attack cost in places customers normally never see. Start with the battery. The Fathom uses lithium iron phosphate cells, usually shortened to LFP, instead of the nickel-manganese-cobalt chemistry commonly used in many higher-end electric vehicles, including the Lightning. LFP chemistry generally offers lower manufacturing cost, strong durability, and good stability across repeated charge cycles. The trade-off is somewhat lower energy density, meaning you usually need more battery mass or volume for the same amount of stored energy. For an affordable pickup, Ford apparently decided the economics matter more than chasing maximum energy density. Even more interesting is where that battery knowledge comes from. Ford plans to source cells domestically from Blue Oval Battery Park, Michigan, a roughly $3 billion facility using technology licensed from CATL, the Chinese battery giant. There is a strange irony in that strategy. Ford's CEO has repeatedly warned that Chinese electric manufacturers represent a serious long-term competitive threat, yet one of Ford's tools for fighting that threat is Chinese battery technology manufactured by Ford in America. That is not ideological purity, it is industrial pragmatism. Ford needs a cheaper battery. CATL has proven LFP technology, and Ford would rather manufacture those cells domestically than pretend the technology does not exist. But the battery is only part of the savings. The more radical change is how Ford intends to physically build the Fathom. Conventional vehicles can use well over 100 individually stamped structural pieces that move through a long assembly process before being welded and bolted into a complete body. Ford says the Fathom replaces more than 146 parts with only 2 huge aluminum castings. Instead of constructing the truck body from dozens upon dozens of smaller metal components, Ford wants enormous cast sections doing the work of entire groups of pieces. Tesla pushed this concept into the mainstream with the Model Y and its gigacastings. Ford is now taking a similar idea and building a much broader production strategy around it. Rather than one traditional line where the vehicle moves sequentially through station after station, Ford plans to build 3 major sections of the Fathom simultaneously and merge them later. Ford calls this its assembly tree. The Louisville assembly plant in Kentucky is being transformed around that process, with roughly $2 billion going into the retooling effort. If it works, the advantages compound. Fewer individual parts mean fewer suppliers, fewer welds, fewer fasteners, fewer opportunities for dimensional mistakes, and fewer operations needed to turn raw material into a finished truck. Parallel production can reduce the time each vehicle occupies the factory. Ford says the system should require hundreds fewer employees per shift while producing a similar volume of vehicles. That sounds uncomfortable when viewed purely through employment, but from Ford's perspective, it attacks the exact economics that crippled its first-generation EV strategy. Every minute of factory time, every component, every worker hour, and every extra foot of wiring eventually shows up in the cost of the vehicle. The Fathom is designed around eliminating those costs before they reach the sticker. Ford is also moving to a 48-volt low-voltage electrical architecture, another idea Tesla helped popularize through the Cybertruck. Most modern vehicles still rely heavily on 12-volt systems for accessories and electronics. Increasing voltage allows similar electrical power to be transmitted with less current, which can reduce the amount of copper required in wiring. Copper is heavy and expensive. Less of it means lower mass, potentially lower material cost, and fewer miles of complicated harness buried throughout the vehicle. None of these changes sounds as exciting as a 0 to 60 time. But this is where affordable vehicles are actually won or lost. You do not get from a money-losing $70,000 electric truck to one targeting $30,000 simply by deleting leather seats. You simplify the machine beneath the seats. What makes Ford's approach more aggressive is that it insists the Fathom will not feel like a punishment for buying the cheaper truck. The company says next-generation Blue Cruise hands-free highway driving will be standard. That matters because advanced driver assistance features often sit behind expensive trim packages or subscriptions. Bidirectional charging is also part of the package, allowing the truck's battery to send electricity outward instead of only receiving it. Farley has claimed the Fathom could potentially keep a home powered for as long as 6 days during an outage, depending obviously on household demand and battery conditions. The cabin gets a large touchscreen, navigation powered through Apple Maps, Apple CarPlay, and Android Auto. There is a front trunk. Ford even says passenger volume will exceed that of a Toyota RAV4, despite the Fathom being a mid-size pickup. Performance numbers remain incomplete. Ford has not given a final EPA range figure and has been intentionally vague about horsepower. It has, however, claimed the Fathom will accelerate faster than a turbocharged Mustang, and that the standard battery will provide what it describes as impressive range, with longer-range versions arriving above the base price. That missing information matters. Range could decide whether the Fathom becomes a breakthrough product or merely a clever pricing headline. Still, the timetable is already taking shape. Pre-orders are expected to open in early 2027, with customer deliveries beginning that fall. Now put that $29,945 price beside the electric trucks buyers can purchase today, and the scale of Ford's gamble becomes obvious. A Rivian R1T starts around $71,700 to $72,000. The cheapest Cybertruck configuration sits around the same $72,000 level, while higher and more popular configurations can climb dramatically beyond that. Chevrolet's Silverado EV begins at roughly $52,800. GMC's Hummer EV is a very different vehicle, but it starts above $90,000. Against that field, the Fathom is not 10% cheaper. It is not even 20% cheaper. In some cases, Ford is talking about a price gap of $40,000 or more. That turns the comparison from specification versus specification into something more fundamental. A buyer could theoretically purchase a Fathom and still have roughly the price of another inexpensive car left over compared with some premium electric pickups. And Ford is not alone in recognizing that buyers are tired of EVs being automatically pushed into premium territory. Slate, the startup backed partly by Jeff Bezos, is developing an intentionally simple electric pickup in Indiana, with prices discussed around $24,952 to $27,495, depending on configuration and announcement timing. Slate's idea is almost the inverse of modern vehicle development. 2 seats, single cab, crank windows, no standard radio, no giant mandatory touchscreen. The simplicity is the selling point. Buy the basic truck and customize it later. There is clearly a market for that philosophy. But the comparison creates an awkward question for Slate if Ford can really hold its promised price. Ford is trying to sell a 5-passenger electric pickup with Blue Cruise, smartphone integration, and bidirectional home power for only a few $1,000s more than a truck, whose identity is built around deleting nearly everything. Slate wants affordable by being minimal. Ford wants affordable by manufacturing more efficiently. If the Fathom delivers both the equipment and price Ford has announced, that distinction becomes incredibly important. For years, the EV market forced shoppers into an artificial choice. Affordable meant basic, small or compromised. Capable and well-equipped meant expensive. Ford is attempting to erase that line, and that is why this truck creates problems far beyond the Cybertruck comparison in the title. Every manufacturer developing an electric pickup now has to look at $30,000 as a number customers have seen. Rivian has spent years discussing lower-cost products such as the R2. Tesla has repeatedly talked about lowering manufacturing cost and creating more affordable vehicles. General Motors is working through its own next-generation EV strategy. Ford has just placed a radically lower reference price in the minds of buyers. Even if competitors believe Ford cannot deliver it, they now have to explain why their own truck should cost $20,000, $30,000, or $40,000 more. The competitive pressure becomes even clearer when you look outside the United States, because Farley has repeatedly suggested the most serious long-term threat is not Tesla, Rivian, or GM. It is China. Chinese manufacturers, with BYD at the front of the conversation, have spent years building electric cars at costs Western manufacturers struggle to approach. BYD sells an entry-level EV in China for around $10,000. In one quarter of 2025, BYD alone sold more electrified vehicles than the entire American EV market, represented by Tesla, Ford, Rivian, Chevrolet, and others combined. And Chinese manufacturers are no longer confined to tiny urban hatchbacks. BYD's Shark plug-in hybrid pickup became the best-selling truck in Mexico, directly across the American border. That should get Detroit's attention. Chinese electric pickups are already in North America. Tariffs are a major reason they are not competing directly in American showrooms. But tariffs are policy, and policy can change. Farley has publicly warned that Chinese EVs could reach the United States within 5 to 10 years. Whether that happens through changing tariffs, regional production, partnerships, or some other route, Ford cannot afford to wait until the competition is physically parked beside an F-150 at an American dealership before figuring out how to compete on manufacturing cost. Chinese companies have also explored manufacturing in Mexico, which adds another strategic complication. The Fathom therefore serves two jobs. Publicly, it is an affordable electric pickup competing with expensive trucks already on sale. Internally, it is proof that Ford can redesign its cost structure before dramatically cheaper global competitors gain easier access to its home market. That context also makes Farley's Model T language easier to understand. The Model T was not revolutionary because automobiles did not exist before it. Its importance came from using manufacturing scale, simplification, and process innovation to make automobile ownership accessible to far more ordinary families. Ford is explicitly trying to connect that historical philosophy with the Fathom. According to Farley's comparison, the target price of this new electric platform, adjusted for inflation, lands in a similar affordability conversation to the Model T in its own era. Obviously, the technologies and markets are completely different, but the strategic question is remarkably similar. Can Ford change the production method enough that a product once viewed as expensive becomes normal? For buyers, that question is much more important than whether the Fathom wins some theoretical battle against the Cybertruck. If you have considered an EV but rejected the idea because electric trucks cost luxury car money, a mainstream Ford pickup near $30,000 changes the equation. Ford brings a giant dealer network, existing service infrastructure, truck brand recognition, and the kind of everyday familiarity startups spend billions trying to create. Add home backup power, hands-free highway driving, and a useful cabin, and this starts looking less like an experimental EV and more like a normal truck that happens to be electric. That is exactly what the industry has been trying to achieve, but Ford has not earned blind trust here. There are very good reasons to watch the details carefully. The Maverick famously launched with a price below $20,000 in 2022 and moved steadily toward the $30,000 range as the lineup evolved. The Lightning is an even more relevant warning. Ford originally promoted a roughly $40,000 entry price in 2021, yet ordinary retail customers never received large numbers of trucks anywhere near that figure. Consumer versions eventually began closer to $55,000. So when Ford says $29,945 for the Fathom, the appropriate reaction is interest mixed with skepticism. We still need final EPA range. We need the actual base trim specification. We need to know how many base trucks Ford will realistically build. We need to know whether destination charges or pricing change before deliveries begin. And we need to see whether dealers treat the truck like a mass-market vehicle or an opportunity for markups when demand arrives. The announced price is powerful, but the real test comes when buyers can actually configure one in 2027. If Ford holds the number, the consequences reach well beyond people shopping specifically for electric pickups. Price competition at the bottom of any market pulls pressure downward everywhere else. Tesla has already cut Model 3 pricing repeatedly as competition intensified. GM created the Equinox EV around the idea of a more reachable mainstream price. Ford itself reduced Mustang Mach-E pricing by about $8,000 in 2023. Now imagine the same pressure entering the pickup category, where transaction prices have climbed relentlessly for years. If a useful electric truck can sell near $30,000, gasoline and hybrid manufacturers have to justify why their similarly sized trucks cost dramatically more. Premium electric brands have to justify why their trucks cost twice as much. Startups have to prove what their extra money actually buys. Even buyers who never intend to plug in could benefit if the Fathom forces a broader pricing response. That is why the most important number here is not horsepower, battery capacity, or even range. It is the gap between Ford's old economics and its new target. Ford was reportedly losing around $44,000 for every Lightning it sold. Then came billions in annual EV losses, cancellation of Project T3, the end of Lightning production, and that enormous $19.5 billion charge. Less than 2 years later, Ford is aiming to sell an entire electric truck for less money than it once lost on each individual electric truck. Think about how extreme that reversal is. The company went from effectively burning more than the price of a new Fathom every time it sold a Lightning to designing a vehicle whose entire reason for existing is manufacturing profitability. Ford has stated that the universal EV platform is intended to reach profitability roughly within a year of launch. Whether it achieves that goal is impossible to know today. What matters is that Ford is no longer treating cost as something that can be solved after engineering. Cost is now the engineering problem. That explains the LFP chemistry. It explains the KTL license. It explains the giant castings. It explains the assembly tree. It explains the 48-volt system. It explains why the Fathom is new instead of being another electric F-150. Ford learned the expensive way that converting an existing high-cost truck architecture into an EV and hoping battery prices eventually rescue the business is not enough. The Fathom flips the equation. Start with the price ordinary people might actually pay, then redesign everything until the factory can produce a truck at that number. That may be Ford's most important lesson from the Lightning failure, and it puts the Cybertruck in an uncomfortable position. Tesla's truck was sold as a manufacturing revolution of its own, with stainless steel construction, large castings, and a 48-volt electrical system. Some of those ideas clearly influenced the broader industry. Now Ford is adopting pieces of that manufacturing philosophy while attacking a completely different customer. Tesla went radical and premium. Ford is trying radical and mainstream. One starts around $72,000. The other is promising $29,945. That does not automatically make the Fathom a better truck. The Cybertruck may offer more performance, different capability, and features Ford has not matched. But a price gap this large changes what comparison shoppers are willing to forgive. If someone simply wants an electric pickup with usable interior space, modern technology, and enough performance for daily life, Ford does not have to beat Tesla at everything. It only has to be good enough while costing dramatically less. That is how markets get disrupted, not always by making the most impressive product, but by making an acceptable version affordable to millions of people who previously could not justify entering the category. And that brings us back to the opening contradiction. Ford's electric truck story looked finished. The Lightning had enormous early demand and still failed to create a sustainable business. Billions disappeared. Programs were canceled. Ford wrote down $19.5 billion. The easy response would have been retreat. Instead, Ford appears to have treated that failure as evidence that the entire manufacturing model needed to change. The result is a truck that borrows some of Tesla's factory logic, depends partly on licensed Chinese battery technology, is built through a reworked American production system, and is priced to compete not only against today's expensive EV pickups, but against the cheaper vehicles Ford fears could arrive tomorrow. That is why the Fathom matters, even before we know whether it succeeds. It represents a shift from the first phase of the EV market, where manufacturers tried to make electric vehicles exciting enough that buyers would tolerate premium prices, into a second phase where manufacturers have to make them cheap enough that buyers no longer need to make excuses. The $70,000 electric truck era might not disappear, because there will always be buyers who want maximum performance, status, or technology. But premium EV trucks may stop defining the category. If Ford can actually put 5-passenger electric pickups into customer driveways for under $30,000, with Blue Cruise, bidirectional charging, useful range, and normal dealer support, then affordability becomes the new benchmark. And once customers know that benchmark exists, it is very hard for the industry to move backward. The biggest question is no longer whether Ford can announce a cheap electric truck. It already did that. The question is whether this time Ford can build that truck in serious numbers without watching billions disappear again. If it can, Jim Farley's Model T comparison may age surprisingly well. If it cannot, the Fathom becomes another famous EV promise that looked better on a presentation slide than it did in a showroom. We should know which version of that story is real when orders open in 2027. Until then, remember the number, $29,945. Because whether you want a Ford, a Tesla, a Rivian, a Chevy, a hybrid, or no electric truck at all, that number just gave every automaker in the pickup business something new to explain.